In the Australian outback, time is measured not by hours, but by sips of water. For Ricky Maggie, those sips stretched out over 71 days between life and death, in a place where people rarely survive more than 3 days. The Australian outback is not just a desert. It is a whole world, covering almost 70% of the driest inhabited continent on the planet. Endless red-orange expanses where the horizon dissolves into a haze of hot air, and distances are measured in hundreds of miles between rare settlements. There are no clear boundaries here, only vast space where humans are always strangers, accidental visitors to an ancient landscape that existed long before the first humans arrived. The harshness of these places is not only determined by their scale. During the day, temperatures often rise above 104 degrees, turning sand and stones into a red-hot frying pan. The sun reigns supreme, scorching all living things. At night, the other extreme sets in. Temperatures can drop closer to freezing, causing the body to shiver under a sky studded with stars that seem closer than any human settlement. The wet season, which lasts from January to April, brings its own adjustments. Rare showers turn dry riverbeds into raging torrents, and dams fill with life-giving moisture. But this generosity of nature is deceptive. The water quickly disappears, absorbed by the thirsty soil or evaporating under the scorching sun. The dangers of the outback are manifold. Poisonous snakes and spiders live here, whose bite can be fatal far from medical help. Dingoes seem harmless, but a hungry pack is a real threat. However, the main killer is nature itself. Thirst and hunger, heat and cold, loneliness and complete isolation. For the Aboriginal people, the outback has always been home, where they learned to read the smallest signs of nature. But even for them, survival here is a daily struggle. For the uninitiated, however, for those who find themselves here unprepared and without resources, the outback becomes a test bordering on a death sentence. It is here, in the unforgiving heart of the Northern Territory, that the story of Ricky Maggie begins. A story that will make even the most seasoned Australian rangers hold their breath, unable to believe that a man can return from a place where there is no return. Ricky Maggie was not an adventurer or a professional traveler. At 35, he was just one of thousands of ordinary Australians whose lives were unremarkable. Strongly built and weighing around 230 pounds, Ricky had a reputation for being a difficult man with a turbulent past. Minor run-ins with the law, fights and drug-related offenses left their mark on his biography, making him, by his own admission, not a movie hero, but just a regular working guy. He got by doing odd jobs, wandering across the vast expanses of Australia. His beat-up Mitsubishi Challenger was both his home and his faithful companion, carrying him along the red roads of the continent. In January 2006, Ricky accepted a job offer at the Port Hedland Government Department. With a few days to spare before starting work, he decided to visit an old friend in Halls Creek, making a small detour on his journey. "I've always had a restless heart," he said later in an interview. This trait drove him to seek out new places, often without thinking about the consequences. Perhaps it was this trait that prompted him to choose an unpaved road for his journey, cutting across the sparsely populated Northern Territory on the dirt Buntine Highway. This road was nothing more than a narrow strip of red dust cutting through the endless expanse of bush. In the middle of the wet season, it could be a dangerous trap for an unprepared traveler. But Ricky had driven here several times before and thought he knew the route well. This overconfidence would play a cruel joke on him. There was nothing special in his backpack. A couple of bottles of water, a few cans of beer, cigarettes, light clothing. The usual things for a short trip, but nothing that could save his life in the extreme conditions of the outback. Ricky wasn't preparing for survival. He was just going to drive from point A to point B, as he had done hundreds of times before. It was a hot day, even by Australian summer standards. The sun was beating down mercilessly, and the thermometer in Ricky's car was showing over 40 degrees. Monotonous landscapes flashed by outside the window. Sparse eucalyptus trees, low bushes, endless red earth stretching to the horizon. The radio had long since lost its signal, and Ricky drove in silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the creaking of the suspension on the uneven road. Several hours passed without incident. Bunteen Highway was practically empty. In the middle of the wet season, few people risked traveling this route. It was all the more surprising to see a group of people standing on the side of the road next to an old Holden. The car had clearly broken down. The hood was open, and one of the men was unsuccessfully poking around in the engine. Ricky slowed down. In the outback, it is not customary to drive past those in need of help. It is an unwritten law that can save lives. But something about this scene made him wary. Perhaps it was a self-preservation instinct developed over years of living on the edge, or simply the professional caution of a man accustomed to relying only on himself. He stopped a few feet away from the group and, without turning off the engine, rolled down the window. One of the natives got out of the car and approached him. Ricky kept the other doors locked. Another habit developed on long trips. "Gas trouble, buddy. Can you give us a ride to Halls Creek?" The man spoke calmly, but Ricky saw something in his eyes that made him tense up inside. Nevertheless, Ricky nodded and pointed to the passenger seat. After all, he was headed to Halls Creek himself, and travelers often gave each other rides in these parts. Perhaps the conversation would make the trip seem shorter. What happened next remains a subject of debate and skepticism. According to Ricky, shortly after they set off, he felt strangely weak and dizzy. His vision became blurred, and his thoughts became confused. The last thing he remembered was his passenger opening a beer for him, and his eyelids growing heavy. The police subsequently found no evidence that Ricky had been drugged or poisoned, and many doubted this part of his story. However, his car was indeed found later on the side of the road, several miles from where he said he had picked up his passenger. Ricky opened his eyes and did not immediately realize where he was. Instead of the driver's seat, he found himself lying on the ground, under the open sky. The sun was setting, painting everything in golden red tones. All around was the typical outback landscape: dry earth, sparse shrubs, not a sign of civilization. His first thought was, "Where's my car?" His second was, "Where are my shoes?" Ricky realized he had practically nothing left. No shoes, no car, no phone, no food, and no water. He was wearing only shorts and a short-sleeved shirt, suitable for a hot day, but completely inadequate for a cold night in the desert. As he got to his feet, he felt a sharp headache and dryness in his mouth. He had been robbed and left in the middle of nowhere, far from roads and settlements. The chances of anyone stumbling across him here were slim to none. Ricky tried to get his bearings by the sun. He vaguely remembered that Bunteen Highway ran north to south, so if he moved east or west, he would eventually come across a road. But the reality of the outback was unforgiving. Without water, a person could survive no more than 3 days. Without shoes, his feet would soon be cut by sharp rocks. And at night, the cold would make him shiver in his light clothing. Ricky was no stranger to the bush, but he had never prepared for survival in such conditions. His knowledge was limited to the basics he had heard from friends or on television. Now he had to put it into practice, or die. When the last rays of the sun disappeared over the horizon, Ricky realized the full extent of his situation. He was alone in an endless sea of red earth and sparse vegetation, without a map, without a compass, without water. Only the starry sky was a silent witness to the beginning of his struggle for life. An airplane flew overhead, its lights barely visible in the evening sky. This fleeting sign of civilization only emphasized his loneliness. People flew in comfort, unaware that directly below them, a man was desperately staring at the sky, for whom this plane could have been his salvation. But it disappeared, leaving Ricky alone with the approaching night. Huddled against the ground under a sparse bush, he listened to the sounds of the night bush, the rustling of animals, the chirping of insects, the distant howling of dingoes. Ricky felt a real primal fear, the fear of a man confronted with the indifferent power of nature, which makes no distinction between the strong and the weak. This night would be the first of 71 he would spend in the outback. A night that would change everything he thought he knew about survival and what a man driven to the edge by fate was capable of. The first rays of the sun found Ricky already on his feet. The night had been cool, and he had spent it almost without sleep, huddled under a bush. Now he had to face a new enemy, the scorching sun and thirst, already making itself felt in his dry mouth. Ricky looked around, trying to find his bearings. Nothing but reddish earth, bushes, and sparse trees stretched to the horizon. No signs of civilization. He decided to head east, hoping to come across a road sooner or later. "The first rule is to find water," he remembered his ranger friend saying. In the middle of the wet season, it seemed like a doable task. Noticing that the vegetation looked greener in one direction, he headed there. His bare feet were suffering from sharp rocks and thorns, and every step was painful. By noon, his thirst had become unbearable. The sun burned mercilessly on his skin, and his mouth was parched. Ricky began to doubt his decision. His thoughts were confused, and strange images flashed before his eyes. Signs of dehydration. Suddenly, clouds covered the sky, and thunder rumbled. Ricky dropped to his knees and whispered a prayer. "If you're there, help me. Give me water." Soon a downpour began. Ricky cupped his hands, greedily catching the life-giving moisture, drinking straight from his hands. The simple rainwater tasted incredibly delicious. But with the rain came new problems. His wet clothes clung to his body, and the temperature dropped. If he didn't find shelter before nightfall, the cold would become as much of a threat as thirst. Ricky moved on, memorizing the features of the terrain. Night was falling, and with it came loneliness and fear. The silence of the desert weighed heavily on his mind, broken only by the rustling of animals and the howling of dingoes. Ricky began to talk to himself, first in a whisper, then in a full voice. He told stories from his childhood, remembered friends, sang songs, anything to keep from feeling cut off from the world. "You can do it, old man," he assured himself. "You've always gotten out of trouble. You'll get out of this too." On the morning of the second day, the thirst returned. In desperation, Ricky remembered another source of liquid, his own urine. "If you plan to drink urine, I recommend letting it cool first," he would later say with a bitter smile. The days passed. Ricky learned to find water by digging holes under black rocks and watching birds that knew where to find moisture. But his hunger grew stronger. He chewed grass and roots, but they provided almost no energy. His weight began to drop rapidly, and his strength was ebbing away. After 2 weeks of wandering, Ricky stumbled upon a real miracle, a seasonal river formed after heavy rains. It was a moment of true happiness. He rushed into the water, drank, splashed around like a child, feeling life returning to his exhausted body. Plants grew near the river, and frogs lived in the water, his first serious source of protein. Ricky remembered reading or hearing somewhere that frogs were edible. Catching them proved difficult. His hands were shaking from weakness, and his coordination was impaired. But hunger is a powerful motivator. He developed his own method. He took a stick and stuck it into the burrows at the water's edge, forcing the frogs to jump right into his hands. "The first frog was the worst I've ever tasted," he recalled. "The second was quite palatable, and the third seemed almost like a delicacy." The river gave him new hope. Following its current, he could sooner or later reach civilization. Plus, the water attracted animals, which gave him a chance to hunt. Ricky began to build a primitive shelter out of branches and mud to protect himself from the sun during the day and the cold at night. His hands were covered with calluses. His nails were broken, but the feeling that he was doing something to survive gave him strength. Days by the river turned into weeks. Ricky found his rhythm. In the morning and evening, he hunted frogs and searched for edible plants. And during the day, He worked on his shelter or rested in the shade. He learned to find lizards under rocks and catch insects. His diet was meager, but it allowed him to survive. However, one morning, Ricky woke up to find that the river had begun to recede. The rains had stopped and the water was disappearing. In a panic, he realized that he had to either move on or stay by the drying river and risk dying of thirst. At that moment of spiritual crisis, he saw an airplane flying high in the sky. Now, with his experience of survival, he understood how slim his chances were of being spotted from such a height. But the very sight of the distant iron bird stirred up a storm of emotions in him, from despair to fierce determination. "I'm still alive, damn it! I'm still here!" he shouted after the departing plane, waving his arms even though he knew that no one would hear or see him. That cry was a turning point. It was not a cry of despair, but a declaration, to himself and to the world, that he would not give up. If he had survived this many days, he could survive more. Watching the birds and animals, Ricky decided to move down the drying riverbed, where water might still be preserved in natural pools and dams. He was no longer the Ricky Magi who had awakened on the scorching ground a few weeks earlier. Now his movements were economical, his gaze attentive, and his decisions deliberate. He had learned to read the desert, where to find water, how to avoid poisonous plants, and where not to wander in order to avoid snakes. His weight continued to drop, but his body had adapted to the meager diet. By the 40th day in the desert, Ricky was almost unrecognizable. His skin, covered with dirt and sunburn, clung to his protruding ribs. He had probably lost about 40 kilograms. His eyes were sunken, and his beard and hair had grown long, giving him the appearance of a hermit. His clothes were tattered and held together by a thread. But most importantly, his consciousness had changed. Sometimes he would sit motionless for hours, watching ants or lizards, studying their behavior. He began to talk to imaginary companions, not because of a clouding of the mind, but to combat loneliness. He addressed old friends, family members, even animals he encountered in the desert. "How's it going, Brad?" "Yeah, I think today's a good day for fishing too," he would say to his imaginary childhood friend, looking for frogs in the puddles. Following the dry riverbed, Ricky came to a place where the river spread out, forming several small dams. It was a real salvation, bodies of water that were less prone to evaporation and had a relatively stable supply of water. Life concentrated around them. Insects, frogs, birds, and even small marsupials. Ricky decided to stay here. He built a more substantial shelter, using the experience of his previous attempts. He made walls out of branches and bark, reinforced them with mud, and created a kind of bed out of dry grass. The roof of intertwined branches did not provide complete protection from the rain, but it provided shade during the heat of the day. It was here that he survived his most difficult crisis. By the 2-month mark of his stay in the outback, his body began to give way. Constant malnutrition, limited drinking, stress, and physical exertion had depleted all his reserves. He began to lose his teeth. His legs, constantly in contact with dirt and water, were covered with wounds that healed poorly due to his weakened immune system. One night, when the temperature dropped particularly low, Ricky felt that he was dying. He was shivering, unable to warm himself, and his heart was beating so weakly that it seemed about to stop. In a semi-delirious state, he began to say goodbye to life and to everyone he had ever known. He thought of his mother, who did not even know that her son was missing. He thought of his sister, who had probably already come to terms with his disappearance. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the branches of his shelter, Ricky was still alive. Weak, but alive. Something in him refused to give up, some deep, almost animalistic will to live. In the days that followed, he hardly left his shelter, conserving his strength. He ate little but regularly, mostly insects and plants that grew near the dam. The ponds began to shrink, but still provided him with the moisture he needed. During rare rains, he would come out, exposing his face to the drops and collecting water in homemade reservoirs made of bark. Day after day, week after week, Ricky existed on the brink of life and death, each time miraculously remaining on the side of the living. His consciousness often wandered between reality and fantasy. In particularly difficult moments, he saw his family, friends, and familiar places. But each time he returned to reality, to his fragile refuge by the dam, which had become his home and fortress. By the 70th day of his stay in the outback, Ricky Mage was no longer a man, but a shadow. His weight dropped to just over 40 kilograms, his bones protruded under his skin, and his muscles had almost disappeared. He struggled to move around the dam, gathering food and maintaining his shelter, but his mind remained clear. At this extreme point of human existence, he found a strange calmness and acceptance of his fate. The 71st day in the outback began for Ricky like many before it. Weak and emaciated, he crawled out of his shelter by the dam for his usual ritual, searching for food, checking the water, and reinforcing his fragile home. Over the months, the dam had become his home. It had everything he needed to survive: water, frogs, insects, edible plants. Ricky's body had become a shadow. His skin, dried out by the sun and covered in dirt, clung to his skeleton, which weighed barely 90 pounds instead of his former 230. His muscles had almost disappeared, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. However, something unusual happened that day. In the middle of the day, he noticed a herd of cows wandering toward the dam. Their appearance meant that there were people somewhere nearby. It was his first contact with the human world in all those long days. Ricky watched the animals, frantically trying to make sense of the new information. If there was livestock here, then sooner or later the people who looked after it would show up. He just had to wait for them. The next day, in the late afternoon, he was gathering a meager lunch at the edge of the dam. Immersed in his usual activity, Ricky didn't immediately notice the distant sound of an engine. When the sound grew louder, he froze, not believing his ears. For the first time in weeks, he heard something made by humans. Ricky rose to his shaky feet and strained his eyes in the direction of the sound. Soon, an off-road vehicle appeared, moving along its route not far from the dam. In the cab sat two young men in wide-brimmed hats, jockeys checking the cattle on the distant pastures of the Birandudu farm. Ricky realized that this was his only chance. Overcoming his weakness, he began to wave his arms and shout, but his exhausted throat produced only a hoarse whisper. The fear that he would not be noticed gave him his last strength. Staggering, he trudged toward the vehicle, falling and getting up again. The drivers noticed a strange figure in the distance. At first they thought it was an animal, but something about its movements seemed unnatural. They decided to check it out. As they got closer, they saw a sight that they would later describe as the most shocking of their lives. A man so emaciated that he looked like a living skeleton. His clothes were in tatters, and his sunken eyes burned with a feverish fire. "We thought it was a ghost," one of the rescuers later recounted. He was skin and bones, barely standing, but there was life in his eyes. They helped Ricky into the car. He was so weak he couldn't speak, only nodding and crying, for the first time in days. The 45-minute drive to the farmhouse was the first comfort he had felt in 2.5 months. At the farmhouse, Ricky was met by a nurse who was shocked by his condition. "He weighed as much as a child, but he had the will to live," she recalled later. Ricky wanted meat, but he was given fruit and pumpkin soup. His stomach couldn't handle heavy food after such a long fast. Sitting in the warmth with a glass of water in his hand, he was finally able to contact his family. His sister burst into tears when she heard his voice. She had not dared to tell their mother that Ricky was missing so as not to upset her. Now she could tell her the truth. Her brother had survived against all odds. The next day, Ricky was flown to a hospital in Darwin. The doctors were amazed at his condition. Dr. Len Notaras, who examined Ricky, told reporters, "His body went into survival mode. slowing down his metabolism. I can't swear to the details of his story, but his condition speaks for itself. This man was on the verge of death from exhaustion. A medical examination confirmed that Ricky had lost about 130 pounds. He was severely dehydrated, emaciated, had sunburn and numerous wounds on his legs and arms. Amazingly, he avoided serious infections and poisoning despite eating raw food and dirty water. His recovery was long and difficult. For the first few days, doctors carefully monitored his diet, starting with liquids and gradually introducing more solid foods. A too rapid transition to a normal diet could have caused dangerous refeeding syndrome, an electrolyte imbalance that can lead to death. Ricky described feeling incredibly hungry in the hospital, but he understood the need for caution. His body was slowly adjusting to normal life. His legs were healing and he was regaining his strength, but the effects of 2.5 months in the desert could not disappear overnight. The Northern Territory Police began investigating his disappearance. They did find his Mitsubishi Challenger on the side of Bunteen Highway, which confirmed part of the story. However, they found no trace of the alleged robbers. This raised skepticism. Had Ricky really been robbed and abandoned in the desert, or had he gotten lost for some reason? Ricky maintained his version of events, but the police were unable to find any suspects. "To be honest, I don't care if they catch them or not," he told reporters. "The fact that I got out alive is my answer to them." After being discharged from the hospital, Ricky returned to his normal life, but he was a different person. The experience of surviving changed his outlook on life. "I realized how little it takes to be happy," he said in an interview with The National in 2008. "Food, water, a roof over your head, everything else is secondary." He became calmer and more mindful, and his former chaotic life of constant moving and conflict became a thing of the past. His bond with his family grew stronger. The moment his sister cried when she heard his voice after he was rescued remains one of the most meaningful moments of his life. In 2006, Ricky published a book, Left for Dead, in which he described his survival experience in detail. The book was not a bestseller, but it found an audience among those interested in survival stories. Shortly after his recovery, he returned to the dam where he was found with a friend. It was an emotional moment that he described as returning to the place where I was reborn. Standing by the water that saved his life, Ricky finally closed this chapter of his life. Ricky Maggie's story provoked a mixed reaction in Australian society. The media dubbed him the Frog Man because of his diet in the desert. Some saw him as a survival hero, others as an adventurer who brought trouble upon himself. Headlines ranged from enthusiastic, miracle survivor, to skeptical, hero or hoax. The expert community was also divided. Survival experts acknowledged that Ricky had shown remarkable resourcefulness for someone with no training. His methods of finding water, building shelters, and obtaining food were considered primitive but effective. An ecologist from Darwin noted, "He did everything he could with what he had." This is an example of how the will to live overcomes a lack of knowledge. Critics pointed to the risks he took. Raw food, dirty water, no fire. But no one could dispute the main thing. He survived in conditions where most people would have given up. Ricky Mage's story became a case study in survival courses in Australia. His case is studied as a rare example of how a person with no special training was able to survive for so long in one of the harshest places on the planet. Looking back, Ricky said, "I had many opportunities to give up, but every time I found the strength to hold on a little longer, long enough for someone to find me. What I went through is more than most people will ever have to endure. But everyone can apply the same instincts I relied on to the problems they face. As they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." Ricky Magee remains in Australian culture as a symbol of human resilience in the face of a merciless natural environment. His story reminds us that even in the most hopeless situations, there is always a chance of survival if you don't lose the will to live. And sometimes that chance, however small it may seem, is the only thing that separates a person from death in the endless expanses of the Australian outback. Ricky Maguire's story is mind-blowing. An ordinary guy who found himself on the brink of death in the unforgiving outback found the strength to survive. 71 days in the desert isn't just a number. It's an endless marathon where every sunrise could be the last. But questions remain. Was Ricky really robbed? Or, as skeptics suggested, was he there for other reasons? The medical facts are indisputable. He did survive, losing 2/3 of his body weight. But what exactly led him there? What would you have done in his place? Would you have looked for a way out or stayed by the water? Where is the line between survival instinct and rational thinking in such situations? Psychologists note that survival often depends not on skills, but on mental attitude. Perhaps it was his ability to talk to himself that saved his sanity. How would you cope with isolation and fear? If you liked this story, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episodes.